Welcome back to another episode of Malvo Talks. In this episode, we are going to discuss what white society really learned from the civil rights movement. And let me just state straight off the bat that I don't think white society learned from the civil rights movement to treat black people better. But I think what they learned from the civil rights movement is that if you have a grievance that's recognized by a significant amount of people, you can build a political movement around it and force concessions from the culture and society. And that's what we have seen. Whether you are talking about all these other movements that came up on the heels of the so-called civil rights movement, I believe that it was really an insurrection, as James Baldwin stated, that African Americans launched in the late 40s, 50s, and then 60s. But on the heels of what is called the civil rights movement, you had women's rights, Latino rights, gay rights, all these other things that came upon the heels. And in regards to women's rights, gay rights, and even abortion rights, see, all those issues affected white society more so than what civil rights was doing. And therefore, as you see in the younger generation, everything is just equivocal. And all these rights can all be solved by the same solutions, it seems. This is why what was given to African Americans, namely affirmative action, was then given to women and all these other things. And let's not fall into the trap of the intellectual debate that, well, black people could not have had affirmative action without it having been given to women, because in doing that, it legitimized, well, the argument for doing something special for the African American should have been able to stand on its own 2 feet and in the gravity of the need that African Americans had to have, having been discriminated against for the better part of 100 years after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were passed. So we've got to understand that in terms of white society, it was in their interest to obscure the whole idea that the African American needed something special, and would go through any lengths to embed that in the mainstream perception and in the pop culture's thought of how this situation of black inequality, the inequality of the descendants of slaves here, could be solved. Part of the problem of why people, and particularly white society, is able to thwart the cause of not only affirmative action, but reparation, is because the auspices of various luminaries and public personas, white public personas, that affirmative action does not need to happen, or reparation does not need to happen, because Martin Luther King did not agree with it. And I have not forgotten people like Warwick Connolly, but it started with Caucasians, you see. And they said, well, I've marched with Martin Luther King, and he never would have lended his support to programs like affirmative action or programs like reparation. Well, I'm going to solve that little mystery for you right now. And I'm reading from Martin Luther King's book, Why We Can't Wait. And in his last chapter, which is entitled The Days to Come, now this is chapter 8, section 3, first paragraph, he says, and I quote, "It is impossible to create a formula for the future which does not take into account that our society has been doing something special against the Negro for hundreds of years. How then can he be absorbed into the mainstream of American life if we do not do something special for him now, in order to balance the equation and equip him to compete on a just and equal basis?" Now, if that is not a justification not only for affirmative action but for reparation, I don't know what is. And again, that came from Martin Luther King's book, Why We Can't Wait, chapter 8, section 3. And you will understand, of course, that what has forced this stalemate outside of the Bakke decision is the fact that the people who are in control or who are setting the policy in terms of white society, I'm speaking in a broad sense now, but white society as a component in this republic, what has stopped this is the fact that white society is not going to sacrifice, economically speaking, financially speaking, or privilege, or socially speaking, in order to make the African American equal without fight. And that's where we are supposed to come in and understand what is our role. But I wanted to straighten that out because some African Americans, if not a significant portion of people of color, seem to be scatterbrained in the dark about this very stark reality, which unfortunately does not have a political solution. You see, we're just going to have to get out into the streets and fight this to a bitter end. You know, no politician is going to present a bill that's going to, or no court case is going to win for us the gratuity and the damages or the policy that we need in order to come out as a first-class citizen.